Story 1. Why switch? Simply interchange both completely at random but still complain about the parts that align with shared regulations from partner countries. Sincerely, the United Kingdom. Story 2. I mostly do not care. People from other countries may not realize it, but the United States of America uses the metric system a lot. We use both systems. We use the imperial system for road markers and consumer products, but we use the metric system in engineering, pharmaceuticals, scientific applications, and more. We learn both at a basic level in school, and then people who need to learn it thoroughly, such as engineers, study the metric system in more detail. If we switched, I would have no issues. I already know the metric system at a normal level. I use it at times. I know the basic conversions, and it would not be a steep learning curve to switch. However, a complete switch would cost billions of dollars. Consider all the road signs and mileage markers that would have to be replaced. That alone makes it not worth it. It is just not worth the upfront cost to switch because we are doing fine using both systems. Story 3. The United States largely uses the metric system. Medicine, science, and the military all use it. Product packaging has also gradually incorporated it. Areas such as house construction, weights, and fuel mileage typically do not use it, but if anyone thinks they do not use the metric system, they have clearly not been paying attention. Canada is a metric country. However, if you ask someone how much they weigh, they will answer in pounds. If you ask how much water their pool holds, they will respond in gallons. If you ask their height, they will tell you in feet. For house size, they use square feet. For land size, they use acres. Is Canada truly metric? The more I think about it, maybe it is not. Story 4. Here we go again. Retired engineer here. Sometime back in the early 1990s, we actually, at least where I worked, converted to the metric system for about 2 years. Then, for some reason, we were told to switch back. The metric system is much easier to understand. Story 5. Back in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter was open to it. Canada and the United States both agreed that they would make the change. Canada, for example, changed all its speed limit signs from miles to kilometers. Once Carter left office, the American government changed its mind. Story 6. They tried, but it failed several times. The reason? The switch was not mandatory. Obviously, no one switched. Unlike Australia, for example, where it was mandatory and it worked. Story 7. We use the metric system, just not for speed, roads, groceries, or drinks. Do you think scientists do not use the metric system? Story 8. Please. I've already thrown my Society of Automotive Engineers sockets into some corner of the shed and hope to never have to use an 11/16-inch socket ever again. Story 9. I am in favor of the metric system for all tools and measurements professionally more than anything. It would help with everyone's tool collections. Story 10. In a heartbeat. I have already switched to metric for my hobbyist woodworking. It is much easier to work in a base 10 system and use millimeters instead of 64ths of an inch when measuring my woodworking joints. Story 11. I would support switching to the metric system and using degrees Celsius instead of degrees Fahrenheit. It makes it easier for work meetings. Story 12. Yes. As a chemist, I already use the metric system extensively, so it makes more sense to me to use it for everything. Story 13. Everything except temperature. Basing the scale on how it feels to a human, 0 is way too cold, 100 is way too hot. Makes more sense than basing the scale on how it feels to water. Story 14. Yes, it is obvious at this point. However, I work in land surveying, and everything is in imperial units. Everything. That means your property lines, your construction measurements, your road standards, everything. It would create one of the largest legal complications of all time to switch to the metric system. On the other hand, it would create endless billable work for us. Story 15. Absolutely. Sick of searching how many cups make a pint or why water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 0 degrees Celsius. The metric system is clean, logical, and the rest of the planet already uses it. Place dual labels on packaging for a few years and we would adapt quickly. Story 16. I understand why people like Celsius. The logic behind setting freezing at 0 and boiling at 100 makes sense. However, Basing temperature on a brine scale means the 0 to 100 measurement roughly corresponds to temperatures the human body can tolerate. Since we already associate 100 with something being at capacity, like 100%, 100 degrees Fahrenheit as the upper limit a person can handle is logical as well. As an added bonus, the smaller Fahrenheit units are more precise, making it easier to discuss temperature more like a category than an exact measurement. The difference between 1 degree Celsius and 10 degrees Celsius is significant. Colloquially, Americans describe temperatures in groups of 10. The 40s, 50s, and 60s are all very distinct vibes that give a rough idea of how to dress and what to prepare for, with the option of being more precise if needed without using decimals unless desired. Story 17, yes. I remember learning the metric system at school in the 1970s because the United States was going to switch over. I am still waiting. Story 18. You kidding? It is so easy to calculate the distance of a mile. It is 80 chains. So simple, I love it. Story 19. Yes, because I am in the medical field and it is better. I also support the 24-hour clock while we are at it. Story 20. Absolutely yes. If for no other reason than so college science classes would not have to waste time teaching it. Story 21. Yes, because we are the only country that has not adopted the metric system. I am 68 and remember when I was in grade school there was an attempt to move to the metric system, but tool makers and everyone else not using the metric system in the United States stopped it. Some companies do use the metric system. It makes it easier to sell in metric countries. Story 22. In automotive, almost everything is metric now. When I use a micrometer or feeler gauges, I use metric. If we can learn that 5/8 is one step up from 9/16, it is pretty easy to learn the metric system. Story 23. I work in science, so I use the metric system all the time. I am in favor of it because I am tired of needing to switch between measurement systems. Story 24. It would take a lot of getting used to. I am in my 40s and not in a science, technology, engineering, or mathematics field or construction field. I drink soda maybe once or twice a year. I only learned and used the metric system in school. I do not think I have used anything metric since middle school. Story 25. Yes, because 1, I am a carpenter and my life would become much easier once we adjust. And 2, it is about time we stop clinging to outdated tradition and join the rest of the world in something that makes sense. Story 26. I'm okay with the idea. I already use it for work. Edit. That said, I feel compelled to quote Bob's Burgers when Tina says, "We're the world leader, not the world leader." Story 27. Oh, please God, yes. I work in engineering and it is just stupid. American-made stuff is in inches, everything else is in millimeters or centimeters, and you end up with both parts in a design. You need 2 sets of tools. All my electrical engineering work is in metric because that is the only option. There are no English units for things like capacitance and inductance. Plus, it is much simpler and not that hard to learn. I feel like people complain about how hard adjusting would be, but you can get used to it pretty quickly. Story 28. Yes, except for conversational temperature. Ironically, Fahrenheit ends up having 10-degree separations. 110, deadly. 100, very hot. 90, hot. 80, warm. 70, pleasant. 60, chilly, etc. Story 29. People in the United States are largely bilingual when it comes to measurements. The remaining places where traditional measurements are used work just fine, and there is no advantage to changing. Story 30. Yes, it is much easier for most tasks. Having 2 systems is inconvenient. Every mechanic must have 2 sets of wrenches, 2 sets of taps and dies, and so on. The sooner we switch, the sooner we can eliminate all the legacy equipment. It will still take 20 to 50 years before the entire installed base is replaced with the metric system. However, the longer we wait, the longer the process will take. Story 31. How would you feel about changing from the metric system to the imperial system, also known as the American system? The same feelings occur when moving from familiar to unfamiliar systems, regardless of how much easier you find one system over the other. Story 32. This topic is at least 50 years old at this point. I think the reality is that it is metric users feeling that others should use their system. It is a bit like saying everyone should use euros or speak English. Yes, things would be simpler, I will give you that. Your average American really has no reason to want to do this. Yes, metric is a lot cleaner, but it is not enough to justify the switch. It has not been for a long time. Story 33. Why would I want to switch from 5,280 feet in a mile, 12 inches in a foot, 3 feet in a yard, 16 ounces in a pint, 2 pints in a quart, 4 quarts in a gallon, and so on, to something so sophisticated that requires you to use multiples of 10? Story 34. The only people who bring this up are from other countries who get annoyed by everything America does differently, whether good, bad, or innocuous. No, I would not be in favor because it does not hurt anyone and will inconvenience over 300 million people simultaneously. Story 35. We were supposed to change to the metric system in the 1970s or around that time, but we complained a lot, so it never happened. I think what we have is still fine. The metric system is not perfect. It is good to use both the imperial system and the metric system. Story 36. It would take some getting used to because I would always try to convert back to what I know now, but yes, the metric system is infinitely better. Story 37. Way back in 5th grade, they told us the United States of America was switching to the metric system and we had to learn it. Still waiting decades later. Story 38. Sure, I learned it in school and would just need to brush up since I haven't used it since physics class in university. Most other countries use it, and it seems more standardized and easier to calculate. Story 39. A million times, yes. I'm so tired of our units making no sense and the conversions being confusing. Yes, it will be hard for the whole nation to learn new units. But the kids today would learn an objectively better system and would not struggle with it going forward. I understand the cost of conversion is significant, but if I could snap my fingers and make it happen, I would not think twice about it. Story 40. Everyone who needs to convert any kind of measurement should be able to do so. However, most people do not and are afraid of anything they did not grow up with, so it will never happen. Story 41. Yes, I already use it daily in cooking and at my job. Measuring things by volume instead of mass is unwise when measuring by mass is available. Do not get me started on fractions of an inch. Story 42. But our obese freedom eagle freedom is gone. I wouldn't mind. Then I would be able to understand everyone else in the world without having to convert all the time. Story 43. Short answer, yes. Longer answer, I would love the metric system for everything except the weather. The scale from water freezing to water boiling does not mean that much to me as a human being experiencing weather. Water freezing is cold, yes, but it is not that cold. Likewise, water boiling is so hot I cannot relate to it in my day-to-day life. Fahrenheit, on the other hand, makes sense to me as a human being. 0 degrees Fahrenheit is cold and anything below that is very cold. 100 degrees Fahrenheit is hot and anything above that is very hot. Everything in between aligns nicely with how it feels. 50 degrees Fahrenheit is chilly but not terrible. 75 degrees Fahrenheit is very pleasant, and so on. With all that said, if I had a choice, I would still choose to go fully with the metric system, including temperatures, for the sake of consistency with the rest of the world. Story 44. Yes, we should have switched a long time ago. We are in a global system, and the rest of the world uses the metric system. Scientific formulas and equations also use the metric system. Story 45. I'm in favor. However, let's take it one domain at a time and we don't have to switch immediately. Let's migrate gradually. Labels. Everything should be labeled with both units. Blame it on global competition or something. Is it too hard to change road signs? Fine. Only change them when you put up new ones. Don't worry, just do it. Nuts, bolts, and ropes. Metric decimals are much better than fractions. Every mechanic already has 2 sets of everything. Let's save some money and hassle by using only the metric system. Food volume and weight. 1 kilogram equals 1 liter of water. Brilliant. Cups, ounces, pints, gallons, pounds. No normal person can easily remember all that. There are certain domains where it would take a long time to transition, such as car speed, road distances, and air temperature. I think Fahrenheit is superior for air temperature. And while the relationship between metric distance measurements is far superior, changing American car standards is always a political disaster. Story 46. The United States already uses the metric system more than you think. However, if there were ever an official switch, I believe it would have to keep roads in imperial units similar to the United Kingdom. The sheer amount of signage that would need to change seems financially impractical. Story 47. Yes, the measurements we have now do not make a lot of sense. 1/16 of an inch, 12 inches in a foot, 3 feet in a yard. I do not know how many yards are in a mile, 1,760. Apparently. How does one remember that? Story 48. I wouldn't care at all. I've never paid attention, but I think the kilometers per hour number is underneath the miles per hour number on my dial. I can see if I'm going the limit or not. Story 49. Yes. It would be cumbersome to relearn how to approximate an estimate, but the metric system is much more intuitive than the imperial system. Story 50. Sure, we already use a mix anyway. Milk is sold in gallons, but soda is sold in liters. We drive in miles per hour, but our races are run in kilometers. I am still using degrees Fahrenheit for weather. It just makes more sense. Story 51. We use the metric system for science. The Society of Automotive Engineers system and imperial system are for human measurements. We have been taught both systems since the 1970s. I prefer the Society of Automotive Engineers and imperial systems. If you want your car to get 20 deciliters per hectare or whatever, that's fine. I will keep miles per gallon. Picas, barleycorns, rods, chains, and other traditional measurement systems are my preference. Story 52. Water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius and boils at 100 degrees Celsius. 20 degrees Celsius is room temperature. Metric measurements are all divisible by 10. However, I am 5 feet 8 inches tall. Story 53. We should do what the British do and have a random mix of both at the same time. Story 54. Metric is more practical for engineering, mathematics, and science, but the imperial system is more practical for everyday life since it is designed to the scale of things we constantly interact with. For example, 5 units is much easier to visualize than 125 or 0.125 units. Story 55. Absolutely. I quit complaining a few years ago and started converting all of my recipes to the metric system. I refuse to allow my cooks and students to submit requisitions or recipes in anything but metric. My food cost went down because there were fewer mistakes when scaling recipes up and down. Food costing, recipe troubleshooting, and teaching baker's percentage became easier. After a while, you develop a feel for it. It is easy for me now to estimate metric weights. I am not there yet on temperature and size, but it is coming along. Story 56. I would definitely be interested. It would make communication much easier when traveling or speaking to people from countries using the metric system. Story 57. I would not mind at all. Obviously, fully adopting the metric system would take some time and a lot of money, but it would be better to accept both while prioritizing the metric system. Some industries are completely tied to it, such as construction and carpentry, which in some cases already use both systems but prioritize the imperial system. Story 58. Retired soldier here. I am very comfortable with either system. Switching back and forth gives me pause. Story 59. American here, and I'm a computer-aided designer, and 100% yes for several reasons. 1. The rest of the world uses it. Factors of 10 are far easier than random factors. Millimeters, centimeters, meters, and kilometers all factor evenly, while quarter inch, foot, and mile are all on their own. The decimal system is far superior to fractions, especially when dealing with precision. For example, 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch, 7/8 inch, and 3/16 inch are very confusing for the mind to immediately interpret without years of memorization. Because the decimal system uses factors of tenths, it is easy for the mind to interpret and understand. For instance, 1/8 inch equals 0.125 of an inch. Increasing the distance by 0.002 inch for a fraction becomes 33/256 inch, but only 0.127 inch. This is significant because 0.127 is very close to 0.125, so your brain knows it is around the same thing. 1/8 is very close to 33/256 in reality, but the way it is represented is too drastic a change for the mind to process easily. Story 60. It would not really matter. I work on cars and equipment that have been using the metric system for 30 years or longer. Buying lumber in centimeters would take a bit of getting used to, maybe. Story 61. Anyone working in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields knows that base 10 is easy to work with, and we use imperial units to avoid changing many signs and charts. Story 62. Yes, when I finally learned the metric system in high school, it amazed me how inefficient our customary units are. I have no idea where our current system adds any value. Story 63. I might miss miles per hour and degrees, but it would be worth it to get in step with the rest of the world. Story 64. I remember when there was an attempt, I think in the 1970s, and gas stations started selling gas for $1 per liter. Most people did not realize they were being overcharged until it was too late. I prefer the metric system. It is much easier to use than the imperial system. Story 65. We already use it for science and everything that requires compatibility. Please leave us alone in our daily lives. Story 66. Hey, we are already in favor of the metric system. We are just taking our time converting to it. You could say we are moving gradually toward the metric system. Story 67. I would. When I was in school in the 1980s, we learned all about the metric system. It seemed very logical. Story 68. Americans. I use miles and pounds. Europeans. I use kilometers and kilograms. Canadians. Snorting a line of assorted measuring systems, I'm 5 feet 3 inches. I weigh 150 pounds. Horses weigh 1,000 kilograms. My house is an hour away, and I drive 80 kilometers per hour to get there. I need a cup of flour and 1 liter of milk. Story 69. They tried to get the switch done in the 1970s, I think. They deemed it too expensive and too inconvenient. I would be all for it. Story 70. Technically, the United States is a metric nation because the definitions for feet and pounds are written in International System of Units, but that is being pedantic. Personally, I do not actually care. I was raised by a family of scientists and speak both measurement types well. What people who favor the metric system do not tell you is that it lacks divisibility compared to the imperial system because the imperial system is either base 2 or base 12. The metric system's primary advantage is scientific notation, which is of limited use if you are not in the sciences. Also, even the sciences tend to use non-metric measurements. Neither the mole nor the light year are true metric measurements. If you regularly need to discuss large number measurements, you are likely to invent a measurement of convenience similar to the imperial system rather than strictly using the metric system, even if that is feasible. Story 71. My car gets 40 rods to the hogshead, and that is the way I like it. Story 72. I have been living outside the United States for about a decade, and I would love for the United States to shift to the metric system. It is a much more logical system for measurements and paper sizes. Story 73. You mean every time I need an Allen wrench, I only have to grab one set? Sign me up. Dividing by 10 is icing on the cake. Plus, it is more accurate. Story 74. Yes, 100%. As an American, I am used to the imperial measurements. When I see metric measurements, I convert them in my head to the imperial ones because that is what I am accustomed to. I intuitively feel the imperial ones, but I do not feel the metric ones without conversion. That will be somewhat challenging during the transition, but in the long run, we should align with what the rest of the world is using. Metric measurements make much more sense than imperial ones. They are all factors of 10 with relationships that make sense, rather than random conversions like 3 teaspoons to a tablespoon, 2 tablespoons to a fluid ounce, 8 fluid ounces to a cup, 2 cups to a pint, 2 pints to a quart, and 4 quarts to a gallon, which even most Americans who use the system daily probably could not recite. Short-term pain, long-term gain. Yes, we absolutely should make the switch. Story 75. I would be in favor of it. We Americans import many products from other countries, and most of them use the metric system. It becomes tiresome to buy tools for both measurement systems or to convert from one to the other based on assembly instructions or similar requirements. Story 76. Gotten this far without having to measure it in centimeters, why change now? I honestly do not care. It makes everything sound more impressive. I also do not have any issues with whatever we use. It is still a 15-minute walk from here, whether 4 kilometers or 2 miles. Story 77. Yes, because it kind of just makes more sense than the imperial system and it would align us more closely with the rest of the world. However, I will push back slightly against the notion that we need to switch to the metric system because we kind of already have. Technically, all of the imperial units we use are by law defined in terms of metric units. In many professional disciplines, metric is already used. So a switch to metric in the United States would be mostly colloquial. While I support that wholeheartedly, it would be a much more complicated endeavor than the transition we have already undergone. Story 78. Yes, the metric system is better in every way. I grew up using United States customary measurements, but I never learned most of the relationships between units because they are very complicated. I had to look them up. There are 96 drops to a teaspoon, 3 teaspoons to a tablespoon, 16 tablespoons to a cup, 2 cups to a pint, 2 pints to a quart, and 4 quarts to a gallon. Apparently, the base unit of volume is something called a minim, which I have never heard of. There is also often a difference between dry and liquid measurements for outdated reasons. I do not know the relationship between the weight measurements beyond 16 ounces making up a pound. I realize now that I think of weight mostly in pounds or grams. I conceptualize volume in metric units. I think of distance in metric units when it is small, but also think in feet, meters, football fields, and miles. I think of temperature entirely in Fahrenheit. Pressure is in pounds per square inch and speed is in miles per hour. It should be evident, then, that the metric system is better. Story 79. Yes, it is literally so easy to understand too. It is better for essentially everything. The only thing that makes sense here is Fahrenheit. 0 to 100 makes more sense than negative 13 degrees. Story 80. Here's the key: decimeters. I believe the reason the imperial system persists is that inches and feet are very convenient for measuring everyday objects with a reasonable amount of precision for tasks like, will that desk fit in this room? Or can I put that in my purse? In contrast, everything in your home is either 0, 1, or 2 meters long, wide, or high, or you have to measure in centimeters, which involves too many numbers to easily work with. Decimeters, on the other hand, are just right for categorizing most things. A pen is about 1 decimeter, a water bottle 2 to 3 decimeters, and a desk about 13 decimeters. My friends and I are mostly around 18 decimeters tall, but one of them is closer to 17.5 decimeters. All we need is a public relations campaign that sends out items exactly 1 decimeter long, and I think it could be successful. Story 81. I'm an engineer. I use the metric system almost exclusively at work, and as I have moved into a leadership role, I have insisted that my team do everything in metric. For engineering and scientific work, it is objectively the better system. I feel less strongly about day-to-day use in my personal life. The advantages of metric, such as easy conversion, are less impactful in everyday life, and the scales of imperial distance and weight are often more applicable to real-world measurements. I would be fine if we converted, but I am not upset that we have not. The exception is volume. Imperial volume measurement is inefficient and should be abolished worldwide immediately. Story 82. Yes, please. I teach engineering and three-dimensional modeling to high school students. I am often their deepest exposure to the metric system. Story 83. America is switching to the metric system, but it is happening at college and in the workplace rather than in schools. For example, all medical providers affiliated with Yale have had to convert their files and record-keeping to metric. You might think that is just one hospital, but it is not. A large number of satellite specialists and general practitioners are part of the network and have all had to convert. It is happening. It has just been flying under the radar for 15 years. Story 84. I use it already for all of my baking because it is a lot easier to measure out 430 grams of water than trying to measure out 1 3/4 of a cup plus 2 tablespoons. Also, water is the same in volume and weight in grams. It makes the math a lot easier. Now, getting gas in liters and keeping my speed at 80 kilometers per hour instead of speeding at 80 miles per hour is going to take a little getting used to. And as always, we will have 2 or 3 states or counties that will vote not to convert to the metric system. So you will be driving along at 100 kilometers per hour and freak out when you see the speed limit drop to 60. Story 85. I prefer the metric system because it is easy to use. As others have said, we are taught the metric system from grade school, and it is widely used here. Story 86. I have been using the imperial system mixed with some metric units for over 50 years. Learning a new system now is not worth the hassle. Story 87. No, it is used in scientific studies. I find this issue to be a cultural one. Seriously, who cares besides bored internet users? Story 88. No, there is no point. All our infrastructure is built around the systems in place. We use the metric system for military and other needs that require interaction with other countries, and that is fine, but we do not need to change our systems to meet the world's expectations. We are America, not Earth. Story 89. Is it really that big of a deal? Most Americans are already used to using the imperial system, and I feel like it would just be an unnecessary hassle to switch at this point. Story 90. No. We use the metric system for things that require it. The United States customary system works better for everyday use. Fahrenheit is superior to Celsius when it comes to knowing how hot it is outside. Story 91. Why switch? Why can't we have both? Both systems are fine but useful for different purposes. The metric system is precise, and because it is base 10, you can easily convert between centimeters, meters, and kilometers, or milligrams, grams, and kilograms. Celsius measures temperature relative to water, which is constant. 0 degrees is the freezing point of water, and 100 degrees is boiling. If I need precision or am working with small measurements, this is the right tool for the job. However, if I need quick calculations and do not have a calculator on hand, such as in construction or situations that do not demand high precision, the imperial system is preferable. Being base 12 means I can easily divide, add, subtract, and divide by wholes, halves, quarters, eighths, and so on, completely in my head without complicated mental math. Fahrenheit measures temperature relative to the human body. So if I just want to know if something is hot, like the weather, it seems better to use. Story 92. No. I can still use the metric system for things where it makes sense and the imperial system for things where it makes sense. I will never use Celsius for temperature. Story 93. No. When I was in elementary school, President Jimmy Carter announced that we would be transitioning to the metric system. If we did not do it then, why would we now? Story 94. No. I actually find the United States customary system to be superior in many everyday tasks. Fluids like ounces, cups, pints, quarts, and gallons. It is a well-designed system, and each size is useful in an exponential gradient. The metric system has none of that. Cooking, in particular, is great using the customary system. Construction is also efficient as long as you understand fractions. Story 95. I think the system we use is superior and I would prefer to continue using it, but it is hard to compete with being aligned with the rest of the world. Story 96. I would be fine with it, but the only thing I could never get used to is weighing people in kilograms, measuring daily temperature in degrees Celsius, or measuring height in centimeters. For scientific applications, I am already used to it, as are most people who deal with science. Story 97. For lengths, I would not, as I personally prefer base 12 and fractions. Base 10 and decimal points represent rounding errors and make it difficult to do the lower tier of division and multiplication in my head. Similarly with time, base 60 works for me. Weights, temperatures, and other measurements I do not really care about. Story 98. No. It works fine for us, and then it would take me forever if it ever happens to adjust. Story 99. To transfer over to the metric system at this point would be so impossible, unbelievably expensive, and wasteful that it astronomically outweighs any possible advantage you can argue. I am talking about all the warehouses, metal fabrication companies, and every possible industry from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine that manufactures anything in the United States. They would have to relearn a new system, recalibrate, or purchase entirely new machines, most of which do not even exist in metric format. Products used to measure the imperial system, like a tape measure, would be thrown by the wayside, tossed in the garbage. Every facet would become completely inoperable. American cars would need new equipment altogether. Road signs and the tens of thousands of miles of road markers would cause extensive road work. And for what? It makes no sense. Story 100, yes, but I would hate to look into her eyes and see a milliliter of pain. Just does not have the same ring to it. Story 101, some objects transcend measurements. A 2x4 will always be a 2x4. Even right now, they are technically 1.5 by 3.5. Story 102, I honestly don't care. It really doesn't affect my life in a meaningful way since I just use whichever one is needed for a given circumstance. There is so much legacy material at this point that even if we switch to the metric system tomorrow, you would still realistically need all of your imperial tools and imperial-sized parts. These would just be labeled in metric units but still not be standard metric sizes, which means that many would basically remain the same for the foreseeable future. Story 103, why? Fahrenheit is much better than Celsius. 0 degrees Fahrenheit is very cold. 100 degrees Fahrenheit is very hot. 50 degrees Fahrenheit is chilly. Minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit is considered extremely dangerously cold. In Antarctica, scientists cannot go outside when temperatures are minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. On the other hand, minus 18 degrees Celsius is very cold, equivalent to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. 38 degrees Celsius equals 100 degrees Fahrenheit and is very hot. So in Celsius, anything above 38 degrees is dangerously hot. But in Fahrenheit, anything over 100 degrees is dangerously hot. Fahrenheit is much better than Celsius. Change my mind. Story 104. I am against changing it because I like the joke. My penis looks only 3 inches, but it smells like a foot. Story 105. As an electrician, no. Listen here. I am 30 years old and have been reading imperial tape measures for over half that time. I am not learning new measurements. I can show you 1 to 3 feet by eye, 4 feet the height of a light switch here by swinging my hand, 5 feet by my shoulder, and 6 feet by my height. I know metric is more precise, but at this point, I know what I know. If it is not broke, do not fix it. Story 106. Yes, I work in healthcare. I have to convert things to metric constantly and do not understand why we do not just use it. For example, my daughter is 20 pounds 2 ounces. I need to convert this to kilograms if she gets sick, and I need to dose her with acetaminophen or ibuprofen. It is 15 milligrams per kilogram of acetaminophen or 10 milligrams per kilogram of ibuprofen. We should also just use Celsius. It would make life easier. Story 107. I already use it a lot for things in the metric system. Our system is confusing and makes no sense unless it is what you use regularly. I would gladly switch. Story 108. We should have switched years ago, back in the 1970s when they first tried to. The problem is most Americans are unwilling to convert to the metric system. If one political party tries to encourage conversion, the opposing party will resist it just because it is their idea. Many people say we went to the moon using the imperial system, not knowing that all calculations were done using the metric system. Story 109. Yes, it's better. There are 5,280 feet in a mile, 12 inches in each foot. Those inches can be divided either as a decimal or a fraction down to 1/16 of an inch. And that's just for distance. Volume, we have a gallon, 4 quarts in a gallon, 2 pints in each quart, 4 cups in each quart, 8 ounces in each cup. We also have spoon measurements on top of that. Meanwhile, in the metric system, you have powers of 10, which just makes sense. Want a bigger measurement? Add a 0 and you're done. Story 110. Yes, but I am an engineer. I use the metric system almost exclusively at work, so I am used to it. Story 111. Yes, I am in the United States of America and a product designer, but switched all of my design work to the metric system. I manufacture things both domestically and abroad, so I eventually switched to using the metric system for everything as it is more precise, more widely used, and just makes sense once you start using it. Story 112. Absolutely. In terms of popularity, we lost decades ago. However, even if that were not the case, the metric system based on base 10 is a more orderly system compared to the imperial system. Story 113. I would welcome the switch. I work in a field that has regulations written in a mix of traditional United States units and international system units. Scientific papers in the field use international system units. It slows things down to have to switch between different units. Story 114. No, and it is not because I think the imperial system is better than the metric system, which it arguably is not in most situations. I do not think we should spend billions of dollars to revamp all of our infrastructure, building codes, and so on. The British railway system still uses imperial measurements, as does the United States system. It is a waste of money and resources on an issue that only non-Americans seem to care about. I would much rather see Medicare for all or universal free lunches for students than upgrade an arbitrary system of measurements that works perfectly fine. Story 115. I do not care either way. I would be fine with the metric system. I know my husband prefers the metric system. He would be happy about it. Story 116. I am for it. To me, as an American, it makes more sense. I like precision, I hate fractions, and I prefer decimals. Having it all in increments of 10 seems much simpler than 12, especially in terms of decimals and percentages. If I measure something and it is 2 marks past 24 centimeters, I know that it is 24.2 centimeters. That is so easy. Whereas with the imperial system, if I measure something and it is 2 marks past 2 inches, it is 2 1/8 inches. I cannot see how that is beneficial. It is even worse when you are 2 marks past the 1/2 inch mark. Then you are at 2 5/8 inches, then 16ths, 30 seconds, and so on. It is infuriating. And then there are weight measurements where the conversions are much simpler. It really just makes sense. Story 117. It is a great idea. It just needs to be implemented over 30 to 40 years. Government should be a model and require all government contracts to use metric units. By liters of fuel, meters of network cable, or grams of crack. Federal highway funding should be contingent on all new signs displaying both imperial and metric units for a number of years. After that period, all new signs should use metric units only. Story 118. Yes, I cannot remember how many cups or ounces there are. I would love a standardized way of measuring things. Story 119. I would switch, but there would be a period of time when I would be converting things to understand relative sizes and weights. Story 120. I converted years ago in my personal life because I was in engineering school and using 2 measurement systems is inefficient. Americans need to accept this and adopt the metric system. Story 121. Jimmy Carter tried very hard to make it happen. American manufacturers resisted and won. It is surprising that we are the only major nation not using it. We should have switched decades ago. Story 122. Yes, with the exception of giving up weather reported in Fahrenheit, Celsius has too large a difference between degrees. Story 123. No, the rest of the world needs to change back to the imperial system. Also, half the world that drives on the wrong side of the road needs to stop it. Story 124. Not really. What does it gain us? All I can think of is what it would cost us. Just the cost of redoing all road signs into kilometers, for example. I mean, why? We have people who do not know where the next meal is coming from. Story 125. There was a big pushback in the 1970s, and they even put both miles per hour and kilometers per hour on our speed limit signs for several years. Then, all of a sudden, the signs just disappeared, and I heard nothing about it again. Story 126. Yes, I would love not to have all these random conversations in my head. 5,280 feet in a mile? Really? Communication on the internet would be much simpler if we were on the same system as everyone else. Story 127. Australia here. Reads comments and laughs out loud. Do people realize you can read history books about what happened when countries changed from imperial to metric? It is not like there are many hypotheticals about what might happen. Many countries have done it. All the bad things you can imagine do not end up happening. You are allowed to learn from others. The world really does not end. Scientists and engineers in the United States of America routinely use the metric system, so you are partway there anyway. Canada is a poor example for the change. In my humble opinion, their change was disrupted by the large trade with the United States of America. Australia never had that liability. Story 128. It is not difficult to understand why metric systems work, and I welcome the symmetry of being able to describe anything in a way that makes sense internationally. Story 129. They do not want something as uncontroversial as civil liberties. What makes you think they would be interested in a logical system of measure? Story 130. The National Institute of Standards uses the metric system but switches it over for us American users. Alcohol, car engine displacement, hospitals and medical fields, and scientists already use metric units. I have not met anyone who can add up distances using the imperial system. For example, add 2 furlongs, 1.5 miles, 7 yards, 0.35 feet, 1/32 inch, 1 chain, 2 rods, 1 fathom, 1 hand, 1.02 cables, and 5/16 inch. Do not get started on board foot or arc seconds. Please answer using the phrase, banana for scale. Story 131. I do like the metric system. Having it be different just because is somewhat annoying to me. However, it is not something I am willing to argue about, and I don't care enough to force it on others. What I wish is that the metric system was all we ever had, so I wouldn't have 2 different versions of nearly every tool in my toolbox. Switching to the metric system tomorrow wouldn't fix this for me. Story 132. As an American who moved to Australia 16 years ago, I haven't run into many issues, but I don't use measurements in my work. The hardest part was when cooking. Many things are not only measured in metric but also in different methods. For example, instead of cups or sticks of butter, a recipe might call for 250 grams of butter. It's not something I can't figure out, but measurements ingrained in my head are not as useful here. I know about how long an inch or a foot is off the top of my head, but I couldn't tell you how long 15 centimeters is without doing a conversion. I think it would be better for the United States of America to slowly switch over and start teaching the metric system in schools as the primary way to make measurements, while teaching the former system as the legacy method as it is phased out. The infrastructure change would take time, such as speed limit signs, which would probably need a 20 to 30-year period showing both miles per hour and kilometers per hour. Story 133. Hell yeah, it would take a little getting used to, but I already have to look up conversions when I talk to people online. I have a coworker from China, and she has all her apps set to Celsius and refuses to use United States customary units. Story 134. Hell yes. I have been thinking of going the lifestyle route and just converting myself. I already use it at work, in the kitchen, and for backpacking weight. All I have to do is switch my Garmin device and push the button on my bathroom scale, and I am done. The only reason I do not do it is because people would think I was weird, although they already do. Lifestyle is a reference to so-called lifestyle anarchists who live in communes rather than agitating for broader social change. I think the real problem is just getting a feel for how much a kilogram and kilometer are, so it would not be awkward for very long. Story 135. 1000%. It would drive the Make America Great Again supporters berserk, and that would make it all worth it. Owning goes both ways. Story 136. We tried that in the 1970s. They even taught us the metric system in school, but it did not take. We prefer measuring with bananas and giraffes. Thank you very much. Story 137. Yes, it makes too much sense. At least use the metric system to convert all science, government, and military measurements. We do not need to mess up grandma's chocolate chip cookie recipe. Story 138. Canadian. Please don't. It makes sense on paper, but no one actually uses centimeters unless you are Eastern European or something and actually pronounce it kilometers and not kilometer. Story 139. I had trouble with it when we learned it in school in the 1970s, and now that I am 60, my brain will not make the switch. That is a no. Story 140. As my chemistry professor used to say, if God wanted man to use the metric system, he would have given us 10 fingers and 10 toes. Story 141. We switched to the metric system in Australia decades ago. Everything is divisible by and in multiples of 10. It is easy. You just need a few brain cells and the basic knowledge that change is okay. There is nothing more unattractive and annoying than a person who sticks with something outdated and silly because they cannot imagine change. It is worse when it is a whole country. Even drug dealers can work with the metric system. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.